Good morning, everybody. As you're logging in, go ahead and open up your pods. You're going to want to open up your Q&A pod because that's where you can put your questions in. You're going to want to open up your chat pod because that's where we can send you some information such as links to some of the polls, not all the polls. We're going to do some inside poll everywhere today, or inside Zoom today. And then the handout for today, which has some good resources that you may want to look at later on. So go ahead and open up all those polls and make sure you know how everything works. And we'll be starting up here in just a couple of minutes. Actually, just about a minute. I'm running a little behind, so that's the way it goes. Okay, let's see what we got here. Okay, we got folks signing in. That's good. Give folks about another 30 seconds or so, and we'll get started. Okay, good morning, and welcome to one of our foundational webinars. My name is David Orr. I'm the director here with the Corner Local Roads program, where you're in New York State LTAP Center, and we're going to get started here. We are doing some polls, and we'll talk about them as we go through the day. Now, this is the sort of the middle of our series for the winter. In fact, actually, we're starting to get towards the end. We have 3 more foundational webinars after today on culverts, work zones, and pavement maintenance, and then other things that we're going to be doing later on. If you haven't been on one of our webinars before, make sure you know where your audio settings are down at the bottom if you've got sound issues or things like that. Make sure you open up the chat pod because in about another 30 seconds or so, I'm going to ask Amanda and Jody, who are in the background, to reshare the link for today's handout. And that's also where we can put links in for the polls that we will be doing online here in a little bit. We're going to start with some in Zoom polls here first. I'm going to ask you to raise your hands a few times, so make sure you know how to raise your hand. And not right now. We'll do that in a minute. And if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A. That's what it's there for. Any question you've got, either I can answer it, Jody or Amanda can answer it, or we'll find somebody later on who can answer it for you. Because when it comes to legal stuff, that can happen. This is worth 1 professional development hour here in New York State. Only the person registered. It's counted as a course, though that's no longer an issue in New York State. You can get your 36 credits almost any way, but you do have to have a pre-approval on anything. Other states, well, you have to check with the LTAP Center, and truth be told, a lot of this is very much local to New York, so I would guess probably not, but it does cover general liability issues in a lot of ways, so those things don't change. Now, as a caveat, same caveat I did when we did the drainage law webinar a little while ago, and that's I'm an attorney. No, I'm not. I'm an engineer. You need to know your municipal attorney. If you don't, that's a person you definitely should know because that's who you're going to have to go through if you have a liability situation that occurs. So I'm going to ask you to raise your hands. My hands are up. Do you know your municipal attorney? Raise your hand if you know your municipal attorney. Oh, that's good. That's good. Quite a few of you do. If you don't know that person, or if you're with a consulting firm, you should know the attorney that your firm uses. You absolutely need to know that person. Maybe not have them on speed dial. Hopefully you don't have that much problem, but you certainly should know who that person is and decide what you can do together to help reduce liability. Now we're going to do a bit of a welcome. Normally I use polls to do some of the welcomes. We're going to come back to the polls in just a minute. But keep that in mind. You're going to want to use the polls. We will use them. And remember, this is our foundational webinar series. We're going to have 3 more after this week before we get into our standard workshops. Most of the materials that this particular class, the webinar today is covering, come from either our Rights and Responsibilities workshop, Identifying Reducing Legal Liability, and Running Your Highway Department. If you're interested, this spring we are running the Reducing Liabilities workshop around the state. You can see in 3 locations, so if you're anywhere near those, please sign up. We'd love to see you there, or if you want any of the classes that we've got. And then we do have our workshops that are starting next week with a couple over in the southeastern portion of New York State. So now we're going to start with 3 polls to give me a sense of who's on the call today or who's on the webinar today. So Jody, go ahead and take it away. Okay, your first poll's up. What do we have for results, Jody?
All right, so it looks like we have about 25% of you guys for 11 to 20 years. And then from there, it's an even about 6 to 10, 3 to 5, and a couple at less than a year.
Okay, and nobody brand new. That's good to know. Nobody who's so new in the job they don't even know where the light switches are. Okay, that's how long they've been. What's the next poll?
Okay. Next one is my job is.
So you administrator, a highway superintendent, an engineer, field crew, legislator, or none of the above. If you click none of the above, please put that into the Q&A so we know what that title is.
All right, so another few seconds. All right, so it looks like majority are engineers, but we have some administration, 12% at highway superintendents, and we actually have 2% at none of the above.
None of the above. So again, if you put that in, throw it in the Q&A so we know what that title is. Just, planner, you just randomly showed up at a webinar by typing random numbers for Zoom. Okay,
All
and then our third poll.
right. I work for
Town, county, city or village, state or federal, tribal, privates.
a few more seconds. All right, so it looks like it's pretty even for county and town, some private, and a couple for state.
City and village. Yep. Okay. Cool. And I see two people work for the weekend. Again, that's always fun. Okay. And then we're seeing a town supervisor, a council person. Yep. Okay. Cool. That's good to know. Okay. So we'll close the polls for now. We'll come back to this one. Now you're wondering why I have a picture of flowers on the screen. I was looking through my photos and I typed the search for polls, and this is what came up. So I don't know if it's the poles that are the flowers. The other pictures that came up, quite a few of my wife, and now her grandfather's from Poland, but I don't think that's the kind of pole I was looking for. But I was expecting street poles or, poles like that. But oh well. One last poll. This one we're going to do via the uh, poll everywhere. So again, open up. If you're looking at your chat pod, you should probably have a link to it. You can go to it's pollev.com/DavidOrPE. And that's where you're from. So just where in New York State, just you click on the map and tell me where you're from, and we're going to be using these polls quite a bit the rest of the day. Oh, we have somebody from Ontario. Okay, cool. Okay. Wow, I like it. Good variety all over. And we have our friend back from the middle of the lake on a houseboat. Okay, that's good to know. I like it. Okay, and again, if you can't access the poll for whatever reason, please feel free to throw your answers into the Q&A as we go along. Okay, so we're in good shape. Let's talk about the law. Now, let's just be honest. Uh, I won't make you raise your hand, but how many of you have actually read Oliver Twist versus just watching the musical Oliver? Probably not as many of us as we'd like to admit. So a few of you are brave enough to raise your hand. And I did read Oliver Twist, and not that long ago, because I was reading a whole bunch of Charles Dickens stuff. I started with A Christmas Carol, of course, because that's short. But in the movie Oliver and in the book, of course, comes from the book. At one point, the person who ran essentially the orphanage, the workhouse, essentially was accused of breaking the law because his wife did something illegal. And back then, it actually was the husband who would have been held up. When he, Mr. Bumble, uh, said something, Mr. Bumble did that I won't repeat here, but essentially said the law was not worth the paper it was written on. Um, we can do better than that. But what it comes down to is all the liability that we pick up really has to have a legal basis behind it. So we worry about liability, we worry about risk, and we worry about torts. Now, not that kind of tort, though I like the tort on the right. Um, it's chocolate with almonds. It's pretty good. Um, what we're talking about is the liability that's picked up because you were obligated to do something, especially at a municipal level, and you failed to provide a certain amount of care. You didn't do your job. You were negligent. And if you're negligent, you may be owing funds. Okay, and there's lots of different reasons why you might have that, but they all have a legal basis behind it. So now we're going to ask this question I'm about to show you twice differently. But let's just start with right now, what is your thinking when I ask you, how do we reduce liability? So again, in this case, we're going to build what's called a Wordle. You'll put a single word in here and it'll build a little Wordle up. I think this is the Wordle one. I can't remember which one's the Wordle and which one's the screen until it starts. Nope, this is the one with the screen. So each of your answers are going to show up. So increase safety, respond to issues. Well, I like that one. That's a good one. Have good procedures. Standard operating procedures can really help you if they're well written. A bad policy can actually be worse than no policy. Training, use caution and care. Make sure your people are competent. Well, I like these. These are good answers. Focus on safety. Okay. Focus on good design. We'll get a couple of more here. You may want to have insurance coverage. You may need to follow standards. Do you have standards that you can follow? Are you following up with maintenance? Maintenance is key, you know. And record keeping. I was looking for that one. That's a really important one. And again, you can think of the kinds of things that you can do to reduce your liability. So let's go through a few of those. And to do this, we're going to look at our tort. Now I'm going to build myself a tort. And because we only have an hour together, I'm going to focus on 7 things that tend to be a high percentage of the liability that we deal with. And that's the duties that you've got, records, trees, or fixed objects, right-of-way, drainage, notice, and then your culture. How do you think about safety? So we're going to go through these things together, and we're going to talk about them each a little bit and hopefully pick up some ideas there. Okay? Now, I mentioned earlier negligence. Negligence occurs when you fail to do something and something else occurs. There's 4 key items to think about. There has to be a duty. Sometimes that's called the duty of care, but there has to be a duty, something you are required to do, especially at a municipal level. This is pretty important. And we'll talk about those duties and responsibilities in just a second. You have to breach that duty. Okay? You have to fail to do something or you have to do something incorrectly. There has to be causation to the fact that you did that and something actually occurs that creates damages. You have to have all 4 of these things. So let's imagine, for instance, that you've got a tree alongside the roadway and somebody claims that you need to cut down that tree because of liability. But if nobody's hit the tree, there's no damages, there's no negligence yet. But the exposure is there, the risk is there that someone could hit that tree. But until the tree is actually hit, you're technically not under negligence. But of course, if someone hit a tree that was in an unsafe location and you were aware of it, you would now have the possibility of negligence. So you have to have all 4. So if somebody has an injury, yes, but if they don't have an injury, or there was no direct linkage between what happened and the damages that occurred, then you may not have negligence, or you may only have partial negligence, and we'll talk a little bit about those things during our time together. Now, let's talk with duties. Let's start there, because that's pretty important, because obviously if you don't have a duty to do something, then there's no negligence. And we'll come back to that a couple of times, especially when we talk about trees, right-of-way, and drainage. Okay? Now, duties means not only having a responsibility, but doing it correctly. Okay? This stop sign might work in a parking lot where I took the picture, but not on a public highway. You would actually expose yourself to liability for a variety of reasons here. But let me just ask you, what do you think are some responsibilities, some duties for highway and public works departments? So again, put a few of those in there. Let's see what y'all come up with. Highway and public works departments. Maintenance, safety, okay? And again, if you can't access the Poll Everywhere site, you can always put it in Q&A. Signage, inspections, yep. Infrastructure, okay. Keeping debris out of things, doing road work, take care of snow and ice. I see maintenance and safety over in the Q&A, okay. Roads, clear. It reminds me a little bit of the old saw they talk about when you're learning to drive, you're trying to drive on snow. Imagine that your grandmother is sitting in the back with a big container filled with her brand new, fresh, hot off the stove gravy, and she's wearing a Sunday dress. You want to drive in such a way she doesn't spill the gravy? Same concept. You want to think and be careful whenever you can, and that includes your potholes, your signs, your sidewalks. Record keeping is pretty important. Okay. So there are responsibilities. Now, some of these things we put in our little Wordle are a little bit nebulous, but we could make a list. And in our class on running your highway department, we actually do make a detailed list of the responsibilities. And you should probably think about that. What are the things that you're required to do? Clearing the side of the road, bridges and culverts, snow and ice, signs, probably the biggest areas where there's liability. And for each of them, think about, is it a duty? Did you breach that duty? If something were to occur, would that be a proximate cause? Would you be partly responsible? And did damages actually occur? Okay? You know, if someone damages their car, but there's no physical injury, you're not liable for the fact that their knee hurts. Okay? But that causes lots of fun when we get to court. And we don't want to go there. We're not even going to talk about court much today. In the list of things that an agency has to do, there are things known as non-delegable duties. What that really means is just because you hire a contractor, just because you hire a consulting firm, the liability is still on the municipality. Now, there are some exceptions to non-delegable duties, but you can't just pass those to an independent contractor. They're still responsible. So if you hire a contractor to put up a sign and they put it up incorrectly, the municipality is still liable. Now, if you've got indemnification agreements, good insurance, you might be able to recover those costs back on the contractor or through the insurance policy, but you can't change the fact that the duty was on the municipality to put up the sign properly, to install the guide rail in the correct location, to make sure that the bridge or the culvert was installed properly, it didn't fail. It's a non-delegable duty. Now, what are those duties? Well, they're spelled out in the law. And for town superintendents, actually, we're very fortunate in that the office of the town highway superintendent, i.e. the Red Book, that's produced by the New York Association of Towns, has a list of all those duties, and they come directly from the law. Now, even if you work for a county, I'd get your copy of this. It's really a valuable resource, something you might want to look at. There are some equivalent things for villages, not directly for streets and public works, but there are things like that. And again, as I was saying earlier, by the way, when we do the polls, if you can't do the poll, just throw it in the Q&A and we'll be fine. That won't be a problem for us. Now, the other thing that all of this comes from is the laws. Now, they're all online. You can go online and search for any law that you want. That's never good enough. You have to look at the case law that goes with it, because the case law is the courts, the comptroller, the attorney general, uh, lawsuits. They're all recorded in this, and those case laws may actually change how the laws are interpreted. And we'll talk about that with a couple of examples, especially when it comes to right-of-way. So you really want to have a copy of the case law, and we're talking literally, 100 books or so to cover the laws here in New York State. There are now 3 volumes that have highway partially in them, okay? So you want to make sure you have a copy of them. Now, how many of you have a copy? I'm going to lower your hands. Let me lower everybody's hands real quick. Raise your hand if you know where a copy of McKinney's is right now. You've got a copy you could go pick up and find. Can be an old copy. I'm okay, because most of the time you don't need the most current. Okay, so about a third of you raised your hand. You definitely want to know where that is. Know where your copy of McKinney's is. If you don't have one, where you can borrow one. One place you can always go is the clerk's office. The county clerk will keep a copy of McKinney's. You should be able to look at it there. But especially the highway law portion would be one I would think you'd want to have. Most county highway superintendents have a copy. And again, you do want the most updated one if at all possible. Okay? So let's go from the law. Let's talk a little bit about records. Okay? Now, records are probably the single most common factor in a lawsuit where a failure to keep a record can lead to a lawsuit, lead to liability, because one of the duties we have is to keep good records. And if you don't have good records, then it's going to be presumed that you didn't necessarily do it properly. So records are absolutely key. So let me just ask a simple question. How many of you can tell me what was the weather 1 year ago today? Don't look it up. I know Google will tell you, but what was the weather? Very cold and sunny, cold and cloudy, near freezing and light rain, above freezing and cloudy, none of the above. And again, if you can't access the poll, you can just put in the Q&A. Okay? I've got a cold. That's a pretty good bet. In February, it's a pretty good bet. Okay? Okay, so half of you are saying cold and cloudy, and I would agree with you. At least here in Ithaca, the temperature was a high of 38, which actually for this time of year is a little warm, low of 29, and cloudy. Okay, so it was actually above freezing and cloudy from those choices that I gave you. Okay, for most of the day. 2 years ago, by the way, it was very cold and sunny. So the weather changes. And yeah, somebody says they're on vacation a year ago. The point is, you can look that up. But can you look up other issues that occurred? And trust me, lawyers will try to find whether you've kept good records or not. And if you try to rely on your memory, boy, you could have a tough time. Okay? So I can ask you a very simple question. Yesterday, what did you have for dinner 1 year ago? So in other words, February 10th, 2014, what did you have for dinner? I know the answer to that, but does anybody raise your hand if you know the answer to that, just off the top of your head? Oh, somebody knows. If you know, put it in the Q&A. But most people don't know these things. So you really want to keep good records of what you had for dinner. By the way, I had pizza for dinner. It was Super Bowl Sunday last year, and we had pizza. So that's how I knew what it was. Um, so let's think about this. How many of you keep raise your hand. I'm going to lower your hands again. How many of you keep a daily log? Raise your hand if you keep a daily log. Uh, Probably not as critical maybe in some cases, but if you work in the public sector and you're a highway official, I would absolutely keep a daily log. Okay? Now, a daily log, this is one of those weird quirks, it's not actually comes under FOIL. We'll talk about FOIL in a minute. But if you want to use it, it becomes foilable. So be careful. My advice is keep a log and then transfer to a permanent record something that you want to share, want to have available as a public record, things that need to be shared with the public. Okay? So what do you typically put in a daily log? Let me just see what you guys think. What should I have in my daily log? See what you think we should have in the daily log. Should put the weather in there. Yeah. What the crew was, what tasks were completed. Yeah. If you made any phone calls, a log. Yep. Any inspections that you did. Okay. And remember, anything you write down, you want to transfer that to something that you can then file, and that becomes a permanent record if you don't want that daily log to be exposed to being able to be foiled later on, to be reviewed by somebody later on. Because once it's exposed, the whole thing is exposed. Because if you keep a good daily log, that can be very, very helpful for observations, reminders, who was on the crew. Yeah, keeping a daily log and going back and just once in a while looking and going, wow, what did we do? What did we do? Kind of thing, which is another reason to file things in a controlled, good way. Yeah, visitors I see over in the list. That's good. Okay. Now, the one thing I didn't see in here, but we're assuming it, but don't assume, always be explicit. Make sure you put the date and you make sure you put your name somewhere where there's no misunderstandings. Date, name, whether, who, what, where, when, why, and how. Absolutely critical. Okay, let's just talk about those permanent records. I mean, there's lots of records out there, but what are some examples of records that you have in your files right now? Okay, what are some examples of records? Emails. Yeah. Ooh, we'll talk about emails. Let's let y'all put these in. That's a really important one, emails. We'll come back to that in a minute. It's funny, when I first came here, when I left Yates County, email was not a thing. Now it's everywhere. Everybody uses emails. Phone logs, inspections, ratings. Do you keep your voicemails, vouchers, any spills? Yep. Bridge ratings, culvert ratings, submissions, plans. Yep. There's everything we do has records in it. Now, do I think sometimes personally I think we keep way too many records? Well, better to have too many than too few, and it's a balancing act because you got to be able to find that record later on. The one thing I would say, and all of us are guilty of this, we all know this, look around your office. We get lots of records and we don't know how to find and log them. So take the time to do that. And that's very important when it comes to emails. Can you find those emails? Are they stored in such a way you can find them? Searches work great, but they don't always work as well as you want. And what happens if you change systems? Can you find those emails later on? And there are people who will argue emails are not permanent records. There are court cases, however, that say they are. My advice is treat everything that you do publicly as a public record, and you may want to have an email that is separate for public versus private work, things you do off on the side. Try not to commingle them, and if you do have commingling, make sure you file them in such a way that it's really clear which is work related, which is non-work related. I do that with all my emails. All my emails, I literally file them. One of the first things I do is flag them whether they're work related or not. Actually, within work, several different filing things I add to them, such as is it for this program, the LTAP program, or is it research or teaching, or what am I doing with it? So I can do it later on and keep them separate because I know it's almost impossible to get commingled since I happen to go here too. So good example of records. Good rule of thumb, make sure you have good records for your public interactions. Okay, whether you want to call them complaints or service logs, you absolutely want to have good records for those because those are going to come back to notice when we talk about that. And if you don't have good information, you can get yourself in trouble. But you want to have a convenient system for people. Don't make it so onerous it's hard for people to interact with you. Okay? Now, FOIL, or the Freedom of Information Law, that's a pretty important thing to think about. Make sure you understand the FOIL process. Sometimes you'll see that abbreviated FOIA, FOIA, because it's actually the Freedom of Information Act. I like FOIL just because it gives me a nice little picture of aluminum foil. But what FOIL says is if someone wants a public record, they can see it. Now, you may need to charge them for it. You're allowed to do that in certain cases. They may be able to look at them without a charge in a controlled setting. And there are certain records that are not foilable, okay? Certain medical records, certain records about salaries, certain records about personnel, certain records about negotiated contracts, they're not foilable. We could spend a good 20 minutes talking about this. We talk a lot about it in the liability class. If you're not sure, go find your records officer and talk. But the idea is if you've got a public record, you want to make sure it's available to the public. So make sure you keep good quality records. You don't want them to come back to bite you later on. And you can lose a lawsuit just because you don't respond to a FOIA request. You do have to respond, even if you don't have the record. You have to say, hey, we don't have the record. Okay? So let's talk about the things that I really care about. Because, yeah, duties are important. We got to do those. And we got to keep our records. But let's talk about trees. Okay? Now, I say trees, what I'm really talking about is fixed objects in the right-of-way. In fact, before we talk specifically about trees, let's talk about one of my favorites, mailboxes. Okay? Okay, raise your hand if you have a mailbox standard. Raise your hand if you have a mailbox standard. Okay, quite a few of you do. That's good. There are standards out there. The standard is something alongside the roadway that will not be a fixed object, will fail if it gets struck, high enough where you can get the wing under it, or the plow, okay, and set properly so that the bus, I see a bus in this mailbox. Your mail carrier doesn't have to get off the pavement to put the mail in the box. There are standards out there. And if you let someone put a mailbox next to the roadway that is a fixed object, like this lovely brick one, you're going to lose the lawsuit. Okay, that's a fixed object. Don't let people do that. You want to have a standard, and that standard needs to be consistent for everybody. And we've all seen them, and I'll show you some other pictures later on of some bad mailboxes. So if you don't have a standard, you may want to think about it. We have some links to some of them on our website, but you want to have that. Now, the reason that I started, though, with trees is because when it comes to fixed object crashes, we worry a lot about trees. Leaving the roadway, leaving the lane, crossing over the center line. That kills more than half the people who die on our roadways. Now, yes, some of that's because they're speeding, some of it's because they're distracted, but we're exposed to liability when these things occur if we haven't met our duty. Okay? So let's look at the fixed objects on the side of the roadway, because that's almost half of when people leave the roadway. So that's a quarter of fatalities. Okay? And when we break it down, we're talking about almost half, not quite half, of the fixed object crashes when they hit a tree. Okay? So that means overall, almost 20% of fatalities occur when they've hit a tree or a shrub or vegetation of some type. And why are trees so dangerous? Well, it has to do with what happens when you hit them. Now, these are some simulated tree tests done in Sweden, I think it was, Norway, some Scandinavian country, done in metrics. I translated it to miles per hour. And so watch what happens when you hit the tree stump. Okay? Now, these are simulated. Some people argue they're too stiff, but look how much penetration occurs at 55 miles an hour. That is pretty much a non-survivable crash. And one of the reasons trees are so dangerous is, you think that bracing isn't real? Well, it is. You got this root structure. If you actually see true hits with trees, it causes a tremendous amount of damage versus a post that's been drilled properly shears off and goes out of the way. So you really want to do something about trees. But trees are tough. We like trees. Trees actually can be beneficial for lots of reasons. And people, the public especially, loves trees. And they've got reasons to do so. But what can we do about tree safety from a liability and from a duty of care standpoint? So what can you do? You could theoretically add guardrails, okay? But remember, guide rails, which is what we call them in New York because we have to worry about liability. It's not guardrail, it's guide rail. Has its own risk factor, but yeah, could do that. Reduce the speed limit possibly. That can be tough. You could remove them where possible, okay? You can have proper tree care. Absolutely. That may be one of the most important things. Remove dangerous trees, have good tree care, especially the limbs. When you do remove them, yes, absolutely, please cut them flush to the ground. Okay? Clear to the right of way. And actually, I'm going to talk a little bit about the fact that you actually want to do more than clearing to the right of way. And you want to have a policy and a standard. There's the word I'm looking for, a clear zone. Okay? So you have to balance, though, the fact that trees, we actually know, do actually help with a lot of issues from an environmental standpoint. They can stabilize banks. They're actually good from a community standpoint, especially in urban and suburban areas. But we want to be consistent with our trees, okay? And so we have to balance the liability that comes from trees versus how wide could you make the clear zone, okay? And what is your clear zone? We'll talk a little bit more about that in our last half hour together, okay? But yeah, the one thing that I would say beyond consistency is do me a favor. When you do cut that tree down, cut it flush. Anything above about 4 inches above the ground can snag a vehicle and lead to a very serious crash. And by the way, we will be having our class on safer roads, and we'll talk about that snagging problem and rail quite a bit in the class. We're holding that in, I think it's 3 locations? Yeah, 3 locations this spring. No, 4 locations this spring. I gotta look at my own map. 4 locations this spring around the state. So now, what this comes down to is the concept of negligent or defective highway design, okay? i.e. road standards. So let me just ask you again. Boy, I'm making you raise your hands a lot today. Raise your hand if you have a set of standards for your municipality. Raise your hands. Everyone should raise your hands. There is a standard out there, even if you don't have one you have adopted. And if you don't adopt a standard at your level, someone else may adopt a standard for you. And you don't want that. You want to have your own standard. You absolutely want to do that. So make sure you have a set of standards. We have a set that you're welcome to use. Those have been checked by municipal attorneys, and they're vetted with some national standards that exist. But you absolutely want to have a set of standards. Because if you don't have a set of standards, you may be held to somebody else's design. Do you want to be held to a state DOT's design standard if you're on a low volume rural town road? Probably not. You don't necessarily need that level. You don't need the width. You don't need as wide of a clear zone. But you got to have a standard that you can support and that would hold up in court. And one good way to think about this comes from something known as systemic safety, and that is redundancy. If we have a good set of standards, i.e. safe roads, and by the way, I wish they said safer because there's no such thing as perfectly safe, but this is a graphic that talks about redundancy. But if you've got safer roads, even if someone's going too fast, even if their vehicle's a little bit out of control, even if they're trying to do a selfie while they're driving, that safe road will allow them to walk away. Okay, we don't want to have to rely on post-crash care to keep people from having serious or fatal crashes. So we want to have good, safe roads. And if we have a good set of standards that we can support, we can actually reduce our liability and improve safety at the same time. And we can actually get some qualified immunity. Okay, qualified immunity is pretty cool. But remember, to get qualified immunity, that essentially means you're immune from certain liability situations. But you have to prove you've done a study. You actually have to have a study. You have to have a plan in place. So if you've adopted a set of standards, you have to show we're following those standards. Okay? So even if you've got something that's a risk, that's a liability now, if you've got a plan to upgrade it, to bring it up to your standards, you can get qualified immunity, but you have to have done a study and you have to have a plan. So you have to have asset management, you have to have local road safety plans. These things can reduce your liability by quite a bit, okay? So think about that. And the probably single most important thing when it comes to fixed objects is the clear zone that I talked about, okay? So you're driving down your roadway, you're in your car, your tire goes boom, and you've got to pull off to the side of the road. And it's an immediate. You're going to be off the road really quick. Okay? How many of you, I'm going to lower your hands. Okay? I'm going to first have you, I'm going to lower your hands. Stand by. Raise your hand if you want to go to the right side. Raise your hand if you want to go to the right side. Okay. About a dozen or so. Okay, lower your hands. Now raise your hand if you want to go to the left side. Now, there's nobody coming, so we're not worried about that. But more than twice as many of you would like to go to the left than go to the right. Let's go look at the left side a little bit. You see those trees? They didn't cut those trees flush. Those trees disappear in the grass. Those stumps are just as deadly as if the tree were still there. In fact, they may even be more deadly because of the nature of how wood deteriorates, depending on what its status is. Okay? So you want to have a consistent clear zone that meets a standard policy. And again, we could spend a whole hour, in fact, we have spent whole hours talking about some of the roadway safety issues that exist. We have some recorded live webinars on that issue. So again, think about what your clear zone is. Try to have a consistent policy. And I am not arguing for a 30-foot clear zone, which you might see in some standards. I'm arguing for one that meets the needs of your roadway. And there are standards out there for that. But let me ask you here, what is the edge of the clear zone in this case? You can actually click on the picture. And again, if you can't access the poll, you can type in the Q&A what you think the width of the clear zone is. So what do you think the clear zone is? And the clear zone is defined, by the way, as the safe traversable area beyond the edge of pavement. Okay, that's typically the white line or the edge of the shoulder. That we can argue about where that starts, but at least we know it's the edge of the shoulder. So what's the edge of the clear zone? Okay, I got quite a few answers, and a couple of people in the Q&A are pretty good. They're on the ball. Yeah. Whatever you thought the clear zone was, even if you think that sign that says tasting room is crash worthy and somebody could go through it, that utility pole is not crash worthy. It's going to define your clear zone. Someone goes off that roadway, they get into that ditch. We actually know that if people fall asleep, they actually tend to run down the ditch line, sometimes even accelerate with their foot. Okay, I had a boss who actually did that, and the car was cut in half. Luckily, the half that hit the pole was the half he was not in, the passenger half. Okay, So that clear zone is defined by that pole. That pole really needs to be up on the backside of the bank, even this shallow bank. That slope is pretty flat. It does depend on the slope of the pavement, as someone says in the Q&A. But this slope is well over, you know, flat enough. 4-and-1 and flatter is pretty safe. But yeah, you want to make sure you don't put something in your clear zone that's not going to be crash worthy. Okay? By the way, I don't know if that sign is crash worthy or not. I didn't get out and see if the post had properly drilled holes. You can put a 4x4 timber with properly drilled holes and it's crash worthy. But again, we can talk about that in the roadside safety thing. And just something to keep in mind. Now, that's the clear zone. But here's the problem. Let's talk about right-of-way. Right-of-way is a real interesting one. And we had a whole thing on highway law. We could spend a whole hour. In fact, we do spend a whole hour talking about right-of-way. So let's ask you, this roadway here, let's assume it's a road by use. There's no deed. So click on where the right-of-way is. Click on where the right-of-way is. Wow, we're all over the map. Some say the edge of the pavement. Some say the front of the tree. Some say the back of a ditch, but there really isn't a ditch here. At best, there's a minor swale. Okay? A lot of you have put it in front of that tree. Okay? Now, the right-of-way is a really challenging one, especially for roads by use. And 90% of the town roads in this state are roads by use. About 3/4 of the county roads, a lot of village streets fall under something called streets by prescription, which is very, very similar. But the right-of-way can get very, very challenging. Okay? The right-of-way essentially comes down to this. Do you have a piece of paper, i.e. a deed or a quitclaim, or an easement that you can go back on? That could define your right-of-way, or by use. Okay? There is a section of law. You pull out McKinney's, you look at the law. There's a section of law that talks about the width being 3 rods. Let's come back to that one in a minute. It's a very important section. It's 189 in town law, and it's a village law, which I've got on the screen here in a minute, or not on the screen in my notes in a little bit. But the issue is you can't have a public facility, i.e. a road, on private property without a permission to do so. The best way to do it is with a deed. A deed is usually filed with the county clerk. There are some minor deeds that can be filed with the town clerk. I would advise you, even if you come across that, to go ahead and file a copy with the county clerk associated with the property, with the deed itself, so it's discoverable later on. So the deed is by far the best. That defines everything. You can do it with easements. Now, obviously, from a liability standpoint for roadways, permanent easements are the ones you're going to need for things like a tree or for ditches and things like that. But even for temporary work, you may want to have a temporary easement that's out there. But let's define highways by use. There are 27 pages of case law summaries. These are little paragraphs. Now, it's a small book, but they're little paragraphs. There's 27 pages between the town law and village law portions of roads by use or streets by prescription. There's tons of cases. The law has got up and down a little bit, but they all say the same thing. By use right-of-way is defined by what is actually used and maintained by the municipality. Okay? Now, within a village, the maintenance is a little different because villages have what's known as complete control. So if they don't stop something, the right-of-way can change. Okay? It gets even a little convoluted, but here's the thing. Are you maintaining it? Are you documenting that, hey, we didn't need to do maintenance, but this is what we want to maintain? And we did maintain it 5 years ago. It takes 10 years to gain the right-of-way. It only takes 6 to lose it. Now, a lot of people go to tax maps, or they use the law. The law says the road right-of-way shall be, the highway superintendent shall open up the road to a width of 3 rods. That's 49.5 feet, 49.5 feet. The courts have said, okay, but if you want that 3 rods, you have to pay for it. Those are court cases are very consistent. So do not use tax maps. Do not use the 3-rod rule. That 49.5 feet while it's in the law, the case law has been very consistent. No, it's not the right-of-way. It's only what is used and maintained by the municipality. So in this case, there's a ditch. If that's been there for 10 years or longer, and they're cleaning it out, the right-of-way would be the backside of the ditch. In the case where we had our fence with the tree, that tree grew up. Once that tree gets big enough to be a fixed object, you've lost that right-of-way because you've presumed to no longer maintain it. So don't let trees grow up. Any tree that's bigger than 4 inches around is pretty much going to be defined as not in the right-of-way anymore. Okay? So by use is only what is either in writing or what you've used and maintained. And somebody put in the Q&A, what about a planned and dedicated subdivision? Again, in a planned or dedicated subdivision, you're going to have the proper legal easements. You're going to have the deeds, and they're going to define the right-of-way, whether it's a drainage utility easement, as in the picture here, or the right-of-way for the roadway portion. You want to define those right-of-ways. Because if you let a tree grow up, the right-of-way by use before those trees grew up was probably in front of that fence. But now it's the front side of that tree. So you've lost that right-of-way. So consistency really matters from a liability standpoint. Because if you've got a consistent right-of-way and you show we maintain to that right-of-way, you actually have got a lot of qualified immunity if you've got a good study that shows, hey, low volume, low risk, and we follow a consistent standard. Now, in our last time together, I want to make sure we don't forget about our drainage notice and safety culture. So let's move on to drainage. Drainage duties are pretty important, okay? Again, if you have a question, throw it in the Q&A. We'll see what we can do to answer your questions. But those 4 keys come back for drainage duties. You got to maintain your culverts and your bridges, okay, to move water from one side of the road to the other. But when you're doing drainage work, the law is pretty clear. There has to be a highway purpose. Okay, so if you see an erosion problem, you can fix the erosion problem to protect the highway. There is no obligation upon the highway department to protect private property. In fact, if you leave the highway right-of-way to protect public property without having a highway purpose, you may actually incur liability. You may actually pick up a duty to maintain that in the future. Okay? So just because there's some natural flow and people don't like it, doesn't mean you can suddenly go out and change that flow. Now, be careful. If there's something called natural versus man-made water, the liability changes. We did a whole webinar on drainage law. That's because it's such a big issue. Natural water, the flow that's been going through a stream for a long time, in through a culvert for a long time, no problem. That's pretty much considered natural. But if you concentrate that water or you change where it goes, you may be picking it up and maybe making it what's known as man-made water, and you've now got the liability until it's back to a natural condition. So we have 2 pictures. Interestingly enough, most people would say the picture on the right looks like a natural flow, and the picture on the left looks like the man-made flow. It may actually be the opposite, because if that culvert's been there for 40, 50 years, courts are pretty much going to say, while it's not the best installation in the world, it's probably okay. Now, I'm not talking about the risk of erosion. I'm not talking about the fact that it will handle a big storm, and new pipes may need to be larger. But what's natural versus man-made has to do with, did we change the water course? The picture on the right, if we change where the flow is and therefore increase the volume, we may have created a situation where we've made man-made water, and that's what the courts would decide. The key is try to design these things to handle the design storms, and that's why standards are so critical from drainage standpoint. Okay? Now, when it comes to notice, remember, you have to have a duty of care, a breach of care, causation, and damages, but that means you have to have been a breach because you knew about something. So you have to be put on notice. Now, there's 2 types of notice. There's written and actual notice. That's somebody put it in writing to you, or somebody from the police department or the county sheriff's office called you up and put you on notice. Those are written and actual notices, and you need to respond to those. Constructive notice is the one where you did something, you built it, and you knew about it. Your constructive notice. Or it's been there for so long that everybody would agree, yep, it's obvious. For instance, there was a lawsuit against New York State DOT, and they said, well, we weren't put on notice because of a pothole. The court said the pothole was in front of the driveway for the state residency. It had been there for 2 years. It was obvious. They lost the lawsuit. So, as part of your inspection process, you want to document those things, and you want to document a plan to get them fixed. And you may protect yourself by doing so. Now, I'm going to go back and do a quick poll. Bring the poll back up real quick for me, Jody. The results for the poll on where people work, town, county, village, and city. So, if you're with a town, so about a quarter of you are with a town, if you want full written notice protection, the town board needs to pass a local law. And we talk a lot about that in the workshop. Counties have a very limited set. They get some snow and ice protections, and they can get some very limited protections, but they don't get full protection no matter what they do locally. Um, Villages, hey, you're done. Villages are already set, complete by state law, complete a written protection. Someone has to put it in writing to you for both snow and ice issues and general issues. And cities, depends how you wrote your charter. Okay, so something to think about. And I'm not even going to get into the state and the federal level stuff because that's beyond what we have time for. Okay, so just think about what you need, what you've got. And I want to end with a little bit of safety culture. I want you to think about safety culture. I think that's a pretty important thing to think about. Okay? So when it comes to safety culture, do you have a good safety culture? That can make a huge difference, maybe more of a difference than we realize from a liability standpoint. Because if everybody on the crew is thinking safety first, your liability is actually going to go way down. So do you have good personal protective equipment? Here's an example. I've met this gentleman. He was doing tree work. Tree snapped. Sometimes that happens. But he had on the proper PPE. So he got hit by the tree limb. He walked away. The hat did its job. Yes, it has a hole in it, but it took the energy and he walked away with nothing other than a bit of a fright. That's pretty good. Versus, I hate to say it, these idiot engineers, yes, engineers, when asked by the guy who took the photograph, well, why don't you have your hard hat on? Well, it's a big rock slide. If the big rock comes down, we're going to die. But while he's taking the picture, there's little pebbles coming down. They're about, an inch in diameter at biggest, maybe half an inch, most of them. While that's not going to kill you, hopefully, it certainly could cause a concussion and certainly is going to hurt. You know, I referee hockey. I got hit by a puck this past week in the head, deflection. No damage because I had on proper protective equipment. You want to make sure you have on the proper PPE. So let me ask you, who sets the hard hat policy? Is it the crew leader, the highway official, the elected board, the contract has it in it, state law, federal policy? You can select all that apply. And the answer, by the way, of course, is yes. Good rule of thumb, a higher level can set the policy. If there is no policy, a crew leader can set a policy. It can always be more restrictive. But the highway official has the power to set a policy. The town board can set a policy and says, oh, we want a policy. Each level going up can set a policy, but the lower level can set one that's more restrictive. They're allowed to do that, okay, if it improves safety. Now, what's more restrictive or not, we can decide, but you can get all the way to federal policy. If you're getting federal aid and you're in a right-of-way, you have to have a hard hat on if you're getting federal aid. While state law says not necessarily for some work, okay? So again, each level up can set a policy if one doesn't already apply. The key is to have a safety culture. Don't hide your head and assume, oh, everything will be fine, okay? We do it nice because we do it twice, okay? And if a person falls here, you're 100% liable, by the way. State law here says they fall, you're liable, even if you did nothing wrong as an owner, as a municipality. So do you train your employees, okay? If you don't train them and they stay, what happens? How do you train yourself and your crew? What do you do for that? How do you train your crew? You do training sessions, okay? Classes, we'd love to see you at one of our workshops. Go to your own class safety meetings. Yep. You can set an example. Well, I like that one in the Q&A. That's, oh, there's another right in the poll everywhere too. Yes, set a good example. I mean, yes, I'm a guy who actually gave his wife a safety vest for Christmas about 20 years ago. She's now on her third safety vest, and I really need to get her a fourth one. Okay? Set an example. There are tons of ways to train people. And what's the best one? The one you use. Have a good plan. You can do live, you can do online. There are tons of options out there. There's actually books. I know that's hard to believe. They actually have these paper books at work. There's videos you can get from us. We loaned out 5 of them last year. We have a lot of other things online. We have tailgate talks you can look at. You can do simulators, classroom training, on-the-job training with good mentors, in-house tailgate talks, equipment rodeos. There's tons of ways to train people, okay? You definitely want to train your staff. And if you don't have a plan, talk to us. We can help you figure something out. Heck, we can help you set up an equipment rodeo. I'd like to see them again. I think they're really actually very effective as a communication tool as much as a safety and liability tool to help everybody get on the same page. Because at the end of the day, what we really want to do, every one of us wants to walk home safely, like Phil Spezio talked about last week when we were talking about safety in the webinar that we had. Okay? So let's finish up with a couple of last things as reminders. We want to have those duties. We want to make sure we worry about negligence. We care a lot about trees in the right-of-way. Drainage can matter. And are you on notice? But now that we've heard all these things, let's see what you answer this time. So what are some ways you could reduce liability for your municipality? Training, yep. Do that maintenance, keep everything working. Okay. Record keeping, good. Think safety, document. Look at the regulations. Try to follow them to the best of your ability. Okay, I'm looking for 2 in particular that will be very helpful. Additional safety training can be very helpful. You want to know your powers and your duties. You want to know what are those things you have to do. What are your requirements? Okay? You want to be proactive. You want to make sure you have good insurance. Okay? You want to have standards. Make sure you have standards. When you find a duty and you don't find a standard, set a standard. Mailboxes, roadways, even work that you're doing. But make sure they're good standards. A good policy can help you. A bad policy can make things even harder. And we all know policies. We're like, why did they pass that one? Okay? So good policies. Think about your clear zones. Yeah, very good answers. Okay? But remember, things can change. Always expect the unexpected. You never know what's going to happen. Now, this is CGI. This is just fake. But watch out. Be ready for the unexpected. And having a plan is going to make a big difference. And you never know what results you're going to get. So, for instance, I decided I would do a search for answers. I searched for answers. And Google's photographs came up with these 2 answers. I don't know how Google's search engine works, but I don't think these are answers. But it does tell you something. Spring is coming. And it will be here, hopefully sooner than we think. But we'll see if that groundhog was right or not. We do have 3 more of our foundational webinars. We have our workshops around the state. Does anybody have any questions they want to have answered before we get done? Did we get everybody's questions answered? Put them in the Q&A if you do. Okay. Well, we will get all these details. We will get you your certificates. Hopefully we'll see you at Culverts next week or Work Zones the week after, or pavement maintenance after that, or better yet, in person at one of our workshops around the state or at the Highway School coming up in June. With that, there's our website. Just type NYSLTAP.org, Cornell Local Roads. Google's good about finding that at least. Though if you type CLRP, you'll get something out of Connecticut with legal training. We want you to find local roads, so look for New York. You can email me directly if you want. And in terms of the question here, it says, how do you get a copy of the town or village books? You contact the New York Association of Towns. We do have a link you can search on our website. Just search Red Book under our website. And the village, you would contact NICOM, and they have those books. And if you can't find them, pop me an email. We'll be glad to help you out. Everybody have a great day. Thanks, Amanda and Jody in the background. And everybody be safe. Take care.